The blood on the snow should have been the first warning sign. Jake Sullivan stood frozen in his doorway, staring at the crimson trail that led from the edge of the forest to something small and black huddled against his porch steps. The Montana blizzard howled around him, but all he could hear was his heart pounding in his ears, the familiar rhythm that had kept him alive through 3 tours in Afghanistan. What he found that night would change his life in ways that no war ever could. The tiny creature he mistook for an abandoned puppy would grow into something that would make even hardened wildlife experts step back in fear. But on that frozen February evening, Jake had no idea he was about to raise one of nature's most powerful predators as his own. The bundle of black fur was barely breathing when Jake dropped to his knees beside it. No bigger than a coffee mug, the creature's eyes were still sealed shut, its body trembling violently against the minus 20-degree wind.
Warm by the fire.
Before we continue this incredible journey, if stories about extraordinary bonds between humans and wild animals touch your heart, consider subscribing to Wild Heart Stories. Every subscription helps us share more of these remarkable tales that prove love knows no boundaries in the animal kingdom. Your support helps spread the message that sometimes the wildest hearts make the most loyal companions. Jake had moved to this remote corner of Montana 6 months earlier, seeking solitude after the Veterans Administration doctors had given up on treating his PTSD with pills and therapy sessions. The nightmares came every night without fail.
It's okay, you're safe now.
Phantom explosions that
Bring him
jerked
right
him
over
awake.
here.
The faces
so
of
much.
fallen brothers haunting his every quiet moment. His cabin, 20 miles from the
Shepherd
nearest
Husky.
neighbor, was supposed to be his fortress of solitude, a place where he could fall apart without anyone watching. The puppy, if that was what it was, weighed almost nothing in his hands. Jake tucked it inside his flannel shirt, feeling the tiny heartbeat flutter against his chest as he stumbled back inside. 20 years of military training kicked in as he grabbed towels from the bathroom, cranked up the wood stove, and began the delicate process of warming the frozen creature. The ice crystals in its fur melted slowly, revealing a coat so black it seemed to absorb light. As Jake worked gently, rubbing circulation back into the tiny limbs, he noticed the paws seemed unusually large for such a small animal, but exhaustion and concern overrode any deeper analysis. "Come on, little guy," Jake whispered, his voice hoarse from disuse. He hadn't spoken to another living thing in weeks. "Don't give up on me now." The creature stirred slightly, a weak whimper escaping its throat. Jake had seen enough death to recognize when something was fighting to live, and this tiny thing was fighting hard. He mixed warm water with some canned milk from the pantry, using a dropper from his first aid kit to carefully feed the animal drop by drop. Life seemed to return to the small body. By 3 in the morning, it was breathing steadily, curled up in a nest of towels next to the wood stove. Jake sat in his recliner, watching the rise and fall of the tiny chest. For the first time in months, his mind wasn't replaying combat scenarios or calculating threat assessments of his surroundings. Instead, he was completely focused on this small life he had pulled from the storm. When the sun finally broke through the clouds the next morning, both Jake and the puppy were still alive, though Jake would later reflect that this was the night both their lives truly began. The nearest veterinarian was in Whitefish, a 2-hour drive on good days. The roads were still thick with snow, but Jake bundled the puppy, whom he had started calling Shadow for his dark coat, and made the treacherous journey. Dr. Patricia Mills had been treating animals in Montana for 30 years, and she barely looked up when Jake walked in carrying what appeared to be a German Shepherd mixed puppy. "Found him in the storm," Jake explained, his words clipped and efficient. "Need to make sure he's okay." Patricia's examination was thorough but routine. "Probably about 2 weeks old," she said, checking Shadow's gums and teeth. "Definitely some shepherd in there, maybe some husky from the look of those paws. He's malnourished, but should recover fine with proper care. You planning to keep him?" Jake hadn't actually considered the question until that moment. He had acted on instinct, saving a life because it needed saving. But as Shadow's tiny paw wrapped around his finger, he felt something shift in his chest. "Yeah," he heard himself say. "I'm keeping him." Patricia provided antibiotics, deworming medication, and a specialized puppy formula. He'll need feeding every 4 hours for the next few weeks, she explained. It's a big commitment. Sure you're up for it? Jake thought about his empty cabin, his sleepless nights, his purposeless days. I've got nothing but time, document. The drive home was quiet except for Shadow's occasional whimpers from the cardboard box on the passenger seat. Jake found himself talking to the puppy, explaining the route, pointing out landmarks, his voice rusty but gradually warming. That's where the elk cross in spring, he said, gesturing to a meadow. And that ridge there, that's where the eagles nest. Back at the cabin, Jake threw himself into caring for Shadow with military precision. Feeding schedules were maintained to the minute. He kept detailed logs of weight gain, behavior changes, and developmental milestones. The puppy responded to the regimen by thriving. Within a week, Shadow's eyes had opened, revealing striking amber irises that seemed too intelligent for such a young animal. Jake would spend hours sitting on the floor, letting Shadow explore his lap and chew on his fingers with tiny needle teeth. The nightmares didn't stop entirely, but they came less frequently. When they did wake him, Jake would check on Shadow, sometimes bringing the puppy to bed with him, where the small, warm weight against his chest would calm his racing heart. Shadow seemed to sense Jake's distress even as young as he was, often waking and nuzzling Jake's hand during the worst of the dreams. Tom Henderson, Jake's nearest neighbor, stopped by 3 weeks after the rescue. Tom was a retired sheriff who made it his business to check on the various hermits and recluses scattered throughout the valley. He took one look at Shadow and whistled low. That's a big puppy, Tom observed. Shadow was already the size of a full-grown beagle, his paws comically oversized for his body. What's he, 8 weeks? For weeks, Jake corrected, showing Tom the veterinary paperwork. Tom's eyebrows rose. For weeks? Jesus, Jake, what are you feeding him, steroids? It was meant as a joke, but it planted the first seed of unease in Jake's mind. Shadow was growing at an unprecedented rate. His appetite was voracious, graduating from formula to solid food earlier than any guide suggested. His coordination developed rapidly, too. By 5 weeks, he was running with a fluid grace that seemed almost supernatural. But Jake, isolated in his cabin with limited internet and no television, had no real frame of reference for normal puppy development. Shadow's intelligence manifested early. He learned his name within days, came when called, and seemed to understand complex commands that Jake hadn't even intentionally taught. When Jake said bedtime, Shadow would trot to his blanket by the stove. When Jake grabbed his coat, Shadow would wait by the door. It was as if the animal could read his intentions before he fully formed them himself. The bond between them deepened with each passing day. Jake found himself structuring his entire routine around Shadow's needs. Morning walks became adventures through the forest, with Shadow displaying an uncanny ability to track scents and navigate terrain. The puppy showed no fear of the wilderness that surrounded them, moving through the trees with an inherent confidence that Jake found both impressive and slightly unsettling. By week 6, Shadow had tripled in size again. His black coat had grown thick and lustrous, with an undercoat so dense that snow barely penetrated it. His teeth, when Jake checked them, were longer and sharper than seemed normal, but what did Jake know about normal? He had never owned a dog before, had never been responsible for anything besides completing missions and keeping his soldiers alive. This was entirely new territory. The first truly strange incident occurred on a March morning when Shadow was 7 weeks old. Jake had let him out for his morning bathroom break and was making coffee when he heard a commotion in the yard. Racing outside, he found Shadow standing over a dead rabbit, blood on his muzzle, the kill clean and efficient. The puppy looked up at Jake with those amber eyes, tail wagging, clearly proud of his achievement. "How the hell did you catch a rabbit?" Jake asked the morning air. Shadow wasn't even 2 months old, but he had hunted and killed prey with the skill of an adult predator. Jake cleaned up the rabbit, disturbed but rationalizing that some dogs simply had stronger hunting instincts. Mountain dogs needed to be tough, after all. Patricia Mills wasn't available when Jake called the veterinary clinic for advice, but the receptionist assured him that some puppies were just natural hunters. "Probably has some wolf hybrid in him," she suggested casually, not knowing how prophetic her words would prove to be. The comment should have sparked more concern, but Jake was too absorbed in the day-to-day reality of caring for Shadow to think deeply about it. The puppy, despite his unusual size and abilities, was affectionate and loyal. He followed Jake everywhere, slept pressed against his legs, and seemed to understand Jake's moods better than any human ever had. When anxiety crept up Jake's spine, Shadow would appear at his side, leaning against him with solid, reassuring weight. When nightmares woke him, Shadow would already be alert, watching over him like a guardian. By the end of March, Shadow weighed 40 pounds. His paws were enormous, his head broad and powerful, his legs long and muscled. When he stood next to Jake's kitchen table, his head nearly reached the surface. Neighbors who occasionally stopped by began making comments that grew increasingly concerned. "Jake, that's not a normal dog," Tom said during one visit, watching Shadow pace the cabin with fluid, predatory grace. "I've seen a lot of dogs in my time, and that's something else." "He's just big for his age," Jake defended, though doubt gnawed at him. "The vet said he might have some husky in him." Tom looked skeptical, but didn't push. Mountain folk minded their own business, and if Jake wanted to raise whatever Shadow was turning into, that was his choice. But Tom made a mental note to keep his own animals locked up tight when he got home. The truth that Jake wasn't ready to face was becoming increasingly obvious. Shadow's howl, when he first voiced it on a full moon night in early April, was not the bark howl of a dog. It was something primal, something that reached into the primitive part of Jake's brain and made every hair stand on end. The sound carried for miles across the valley, a mournful, powerful call that spoke of wild places and ancient freedoms. Other signs accumulated like evidence Jake wasn't ready to examine. The way Shadow's eyes reflected light in the darkness, glowing like green fire, his preference for raw meat over kibble, the way he moved through the forest in absolute silence despite his increasing size, the way other dogs reacted to him with immediate submission or terror, the way he watched the tree line at night, alert to movements and sounds Jake couldn't perceive. But for Jake, Shadow was salvation. The dog, or whatever he was, had given him purpose again. The rigid structure of care and training, the physical exercise of their increasingly long hikes, the companionship that asked nothing but presence, all of it was slowly piecing Jake back together. His medication sat untouched in the cabinet. His therapy appointments were forgotten. Shadow was healing him in ways no human intervention had managed. As April turned to May, Shadow's growth showed no signs of slowing. At what Jake believed to be 3 months old, Shadow weighed 70 pounds of pure muscle and sinew. His coat was magnificent, so black it had blue highlights in the sun, thick enough that Jake's fingers disappeared when he petted him. Those amber eyes held an intelligence that sometimes made Jake feel like he was the pet, not the other way around. The pivotal moment came on a May evening when Shadow was supposedly 14 weeks old. Jake had been splitting wood behind the cabin when he heard it, a deep, rumbling growl that made his blood freeze. He turned to find Shadow standing between him and the forest edge, hackles raised, lips pulled back to reveal teeth that were definitely too long, too sharp, too numerous for any dog breed Jake knew. A mountain lion emerged from the trees, drawn perhaps by the scent of the deer Jake had processed the day before. It was a big male, probably 200 pounds, and it looked at Jake like he was nothing more than another meal option. Jake's rifle was inside the cabin, 20 feet away. He gripped the axe handle, knowing it would be useless against those claws and teeth. Shadow moved forward, placing himself firmly between Jake and the cat. The sound that came from his throat was nothing like a dog's warning bark. It was a roar of challenge, a promise of violence that made the mountain lion pause. Shadow, at 70 pounds, should have been nothing but a snack for the big cat, but something in his posture, his voice, his presence spoke of a predator recognizing another predator. The standoff lasted perhaps 30 seconds, though it felt like hours to Jake. The mountain lion eventually backed away, melting into the forest with a final snarl of displeasure. Shadow maintained his protective stance until the threat was completely gone, then turned to Jake with tail wagging, as if he had just performed a simple trick. Jake sank to his knees, adrenaline making his hands shake as he buried them in Shadow's thick fur. "What are you, boy?" he whispered. "What are you really?" That night, Jake sat at his computer, using his limited internet to research. He typed in Shadow's characteristics: the size, the growth rate, the hunting ability, the vocalizations, the eye color, the coat, the behavior. The results that came back made him close the laptop with trembling fingers. Every search led to the same conclusion, the same impossible answer that he wasn't ready to accept. But Shadow, curled at his feet, warm and solid and real, didn't care what the internet said he might be. He was Jake's companion, Jake's protector, Jake's reason to keep going when the darkness crept in. Whatever truth was growing alongside Shadow's remarkable body, it would have to wait. Some truths demanded their own timeline, and Jake wasn't ready to face this one. As May progressed, the signs became undeniable. Shadow's hunting expeditions grew bold. He would disappear for hours, returning with evidence of successful kills. His howls, always at night, were answered now by distant calls from the mountains, wild voices that made Jake's skin crawl even as Shadow's ears perked with interest. The puppy that had fit in Jake's palm was becoming something magnificent and terrifying in equal measure. Local ranchers started reporting unusual wolf activity, though no wolves had been documented in this part of Montana for decades. Livestock stayed nervous. Dogs refused to leave their porches at night, and more than one person claimed to have seen a massive black shape moving through the forests. Jake kept Shadow closer to home, but he couldn't cage what was becoming increasingly clear was not meant to be caged. The morning that would change everything started like any other. Jake woke to find Shadow watching him from across the room, those amber eyes holding depths that no dog's eyes should contain. They went through their morning routine: breakfast, Jake's coffee, Shadow's raw beef, a walk along their usual trail. But Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting, that the careful balance they had built was about to tip. He was right. Change was coming in the form of a routine veterinary checkup that would shatter the illusion Jake had carefully maintained. The truth about Shadow couldn't be avoided much longer, and with it would come choices Jake never imagined he would have to make. The abandoned puppy he had saved was about to reveal itself as something that would challenge everything Jake thought he knew about the bond between human and animal. But that morning, walking through the Montana wilderness with Shadow padding silently beside him, Jake allowed himself to exist in the peace they had created together. Whatever Shadow truly was, he had saved Jake as surely as Jake had saved him. The storm that had brought them together was nothing compared to the storm that was about to break when the world discovered what was living in Jake Sullivan's cabin. The veterinary clinic in Whitefish had seen its share of unusual animals over the years, but nothing quite prepared Dr. Patricia Mills for what walked through her door that Tuesday morning in late May. Jake had called ahead for Shadow's 4-month checkup, though by his calculations, the animal was actually closer to 16 weeks old. What entered the examination room, however, defied every expectation Patricia had developed in 30 years of veterinary practice. Shadow had to duck his head to fit through the standard door frame. At 90 pounds, he moved with a fluid grace that made the floor vibrate slightly with each step. His shoulders were broad and powerful, his chest deep, his legs long and built for endurance running. When he looked at Patricia with those penetrating amber eyes, she took an involuntary step backward, her primitive brain recognizing something that her rational mind was still trying to deny. "This can't be the same puppy you brought in 3 months ago," Patricia said, her voice carefully controlled even as her hands trembled slightly. "Jake, this animal is the size of a fully grown Great Dane, but he's built like what, Doc?" Jake asked, though he already knew what she was struggling to say. The word hung unspoken between them, too impossible to voice in the fluorescent normality of the examination room. Patricia approached Shadow slowly, her movements deliberate and non-threatening. To her surprise, Shadow sat calmly, allowing her to run her hands over his body, though his eyes never left her face. His muscles were hard under the thick black coat, his bone structure massive and different from any domestic dog she had ever examined. When she looked at his teeth, she had to suppress a gasp. The canines were nearly 2 inches long, designed for gripping and tearing, not the teeth of an animal meant to eat kibble from a bowl. "Jake, I need to be straight with you," Patricia said, stepping back from the examination table that Shadow made look comically small. "This is not a dog. I don't know how or why, but what you have here is not any breed of domestic dog I've ever seen." Jake's jaw clenched, a muscle ticking in his cheek. He was dying in the snow. "I couldn't just leave him." "I'm not saying you did wrong," Patricia replied gently, "but we need to figure out what he actually is. There are legal implications, safety concerns, not to mention the biological impossibility of what I'm looking at. Would you consent to a DNA test?" The wait for results was supposed to take 2 weeks. Patricia expedited it, paying extra from her own pocket because she had to know. She had to understand what was standing in her clinic wearing a collar and leash like a pet when every instinct in her body screamed that this was an apex predator. During those 2 weeks, Jake found himself watching Shadow with new eyes. The animal's behavior became impossible to rationalize as mere dog quirks. Shadow had started patrolling the perimeter of Jake's property each night, marking territory in a wide circle that encompassed several acres. His howls, which came every evening now, were being answered by multiple voices from the deep wilderness, conversations in a language Jake couldn't understand, but that made his hair stand on end. The hunting had escalated too. Shadow no longer bothered with rabbits or squirrels. Jake had found the remains of a young deer not 100 yards from the cabin, taken down and partially consumed with surgical precision. The kill had been clean, professional, the work of an animal that knew exactly where to bite to cause instant death. When Jake confronted Shadow about it, the animal had simply looked at him with those intelligent eyes, as if to say this was his nature, take it or leave it. But it was the protective behavior that affected Jake the most. Shadow had appointed himself Jake's guardian, a role he took seriously enough that even Tom Henderson had stopped making surprise visits. The retired sheriff had made the mistake of approaching Jake from behind during a walk, and Shadow's reaction had been instantaneous and terrifying. No actual violence, just a positioning of his body, a rumble from his chest, and a display of teeth that made Tom freeze in his tracks until Jake called Shadow off. "That's not a pet, Jake," Tom had said afterward, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool mountain air. "That's a weapon with fur." Jake wanted to argue, but how could he? Shadow was becoming something that challenged every definition of what a pet should be. But when they were alone in the cabin, Shadow was gentle, affectionate, even playful in his own dignified way. He would rest his massive head on Jake's lap while Jake read, his weight a comforting presence. He seemed to sense Jake's moods with uncanny accuracy, providing distraction during anxiety attacks and quiet companionship during the dark moments when memories of war threatened to overwhelm. The DNA results arrived on a Thursday morning that started with unusual bird activity around the cabin. Ravens, dozens of them, had gathered in the trees, their harsh calls creating an ominous soundtrack as Jake drove to the veterinary clinic. Shadow sat in the back of Jake's truck, alert to every movement, every sound, as if he knew something significant was about to happen. Patricia's face when she handed Jake the results told him everything before he even looked at the paper. Her professional composure was cracked, replaced by a mixture of awe and concern that made Jake's stomach clench. He looked down at the genetic analysis report, the scientific terminology swimming before his eyes until one line came into sharp focus. Canis lupus occidentalis, northwestern wolf, 100% match. "This is impossible," Patricia said, pacing her office while Jake sat numbly in the chair, the paper trembling in his hands. "A pure wolf. Not even a hybrid. Jake, do you understand what this means?" Jake understood perfectly. He hadn't rescued an abandoned puppy. He had taken in a wolf pup, raised it as a dog, created a bond that shouldn't exist between a wild predator and a damaged human. Everything made sense now. The rapid growth, the hunting ability, the howls, the intelligence that went beyond canine comprehension. Shadow was not Shadow at all. He was a wolf, specifically a northwestern wolf, one of the largest subspecies in North America. "He must have been the runt," Patricia continued, thinking out loud. "Abandoned by his pack during that blizzard. Mother probably had too many pups to feed, left the weakest behind. It happens in nature, cruel but necessary for survival of the pack. What do I do now? Jake asked, his voice hollow. The thought of losing Shadow, of having him taken away, made something in his chest constrict painfully. Patricia stopped pacing and looked at him with sympathy. Legally, you're required to report this to Fish and Wildlife. Keeping a wolf without permits is a federal offense. They'll want to relocate him to a sanctuary or reintroduce him to the wild. She paused, studying Jake's devastated expression. Realistically, you have some time to figure this out. But Jake, you need to understand the danger here. Wolves are not pets. As he matures, his instincts will become stronger. He could hurt you, or worse, hurt someone else. The drive home was silent except for Shadow's occasional whine from the back, sensing Jake's distress. Jake's mind raced through possibilities, each more impossible than the last. He couldn't give Shadow up, not when the wolf was the only thing standing between him and the abyss of his PTSD. But keeping him was illegal, potentially dangerous, and ethically questionable. Was it fair to Shadow to keep him from his own kind? Was it safe for Jake to share his home with an animal capable of killing him with a single bite? That night, Jake sat on his porch with Shadow beside him, both watching the moon rise over the mountains. Shadow's howl, when it came, was different this time, mournful and questioning, as if he too understood that something had changed between them. The answering calls from the wilderness seemed closer tonight, more insistent. You belong out there, don't you? Jake said softly, running his fingers through Shadow's thick fur. With them, not with me. Shadow turned those amber eyes on Jake, and for a moment, Jake could have sworn he saw understanding there. Maybe even disagreement. The wolf leaned against Jake's leg, a gesture of affection that seemed to say he had already chosen where he belonged. Over the next days, Jake threw himself into research about wolves, about their behavior, their needs, their social structures. What he learned both fascinated and terrified him. Wolves were apex predators, yes, but they were also deeply social creatures with complex emotional lives. They formed bonds that lasted lifetimes, showed loyalty that put humans to shame, and displayed intelligence that rivaled primates. The more Jake read, the more he understood that Shadow's behavior toward him was not typical wolf behavior at all. Somehow, impossibly, Shadow had imprinted on him as family. The first test came a week after the DNA results, when a pack of actual wolves appeared at the edge of Jake's property. Jake woke to find Shadow standing at the window, every muscle tense, watching 5 wolves arranged in a semicircle at the tree line. They were magnificent creatures, but none had Shadow's pure black coat or impressive size. The alpha, a grizzled gray male, took a step forward and howled, a clear invitation or challenge. Jake's hand moved to his rifle, but Shadow turned and looked at him, actually shaking his head in a gesture so human-like that Jake froze. The wolf padded to the door and waited. Against every instinct, every piece of common sense, Jake opened it. Shadow walked out slowly, his movements confident but not aggressive. The pack watched him approach, their body language shifting from curiosity to submission as they seemed to recognize something in him that Jake couldn't perceive. The gray alpha lowered his head slightly, not quite submission, but acknowledgement. For 10 minutes, Shadow stood among his own kind, and Jake waited for him to disappear into the forest where he belonged. But Shadow turned back. He walked away from the pack, back to Jake's porch, and sat down beside the human who had raised him. The message was clear. He had made his choice. The pack melted back into the forest, and Jake sank to his knees, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had just happened. "You chose me," he whispered, and Shadow leaned into him, nearly knocking him over with his weight. Word started spreading through the valley about Jake's unusual dog. People talked in the general store, at the gas station, in the diner where Jake never went but where his story traveled anyway. Most dismissed it as mountain folk exaggeration, but some, especially the ranchers who had lost livestock to wolf predation, started asking uncomfortable questions. Jake knew he was living on borrowed time. Someone would eventually report him to the authorities, or Shadow would do something that couldn't be explained away as aggressive dog behavior. But each day that passed strengthened the bond between them. Shadow learned to modulate his behavior around the few humans he encountered, never showing aggression unless Jake was threatened. He even tolerated Tom Henderson's occasional visits, though he watched the retired sheriff with unblinking attention that made Tom sweat. The transformation in Jake was even more remarkable than Shadow's impossible growth. The nightmares hadn't disappeared entirely, but they came rarely now. The hypervigilance that had made grocery shopping an ordeal had mellowed into manageable awareness. He hadn't touched his anxiety medication in weeks. The constant mental replay of combat scenarios had been replaced by focus on Shadow's training and care. The incident that would force Jake's hand came on a humid July evening when Shadow was nearly 6 months old, though he looked like a fully mature wolf. A group of hikers, lost and panicking as darkness fell, stumbled onto Jake's property. Shadow's response was immediate and protective, placing himself between Jake and the strangers with a display of territorial aggression that left no doubt about his nature. The hikers fled the moment Jake called Shadow back, but not before one of them captured the encounter on a cell phone. Within days, the video was circulating on social media with captions like, "Montana man keeps wild wolf as pet," and "Is this legal?" The attention Jake had desperately wanted to avoid was coming, whether he was ready or not. Tom Henderson showed up the next morning with a grim expression. "Fish and wildlife will be here within the week," he warned. "Someone from the state office called me asking questions. Jake, you need to decide what you're going to do." Jake looked at Shadow, who was lying in a patch of sunlight, looking for all the world like an oversized dog enjoying a lazy morning. But Jake knew better. He had seen Shadow take down a full-grown elk 3 days ago, had watched him communicate with a wild pack that still visited periodically, had felt the primal power contained in that black-furred body. "What would you do?" Jake asked Tom. Tom was quiet for a long moment, watching Shadow watch them with those two intelligent eyes. "I had a partner once," he finally said. "Best cop I ever worked with. Saved my life more times than I can count. When the department wanted to retire him for some bureaucratic bullshit reason, I fought like hell to keep him. Lost my promotion over it." He paused. "He was just a human. What you've got there saved your life in a different way, didn't he?" Jake nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. "Then you fight," Tom said simply. "You find a way to make it legal, or you find a way to disappear. But you don't let them take him if he doesn't want to go." After Tom left, Jake sat with Shadow on the porch, both of them looking out at the wilderness that had brought them together. The authorities were coming. Decisions had to be made. The fairy tale of a man and his dog was ending, and the complex reality of a human-wolf bond was about to be tested in ways neither of them could fully anticipate. But in that moment, with Shadow's warm weight against his side and the Montana mountains standing eternal around them, Jake made his choice. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The abandoned puppy who had turned out to be a wolf had saved him from his demons. Now it was Jake's turn to save Shadow from a world that wouldn't understand what they had built together. The sound of vehicles on the distant road made Shadow's ears perk up, and Jake's hand found the thick fur at the wolf's neck. The reckoning was coming sooner than expected. Everything they had built, the trust, the love, the impossible bond between warrior and wolf, was about to be put to the ultimate test. The convoy of official vehicles that wound up Jake's dirt road on that July morning looked like an invasion force. 2 trucks from Montana Fish and Wildlife, a sheriff's cruiser, and a veterinary transport van designed for large animal capture. Jake watched them approach from his window, his hand resting on Shadow's broad head. The wolf stood perfectly still, his muscles coiled with tension, sensing the threat these visitors represented. "Easy, boy," Jake murmured, though his own heart was racing with the familiar rhythm of impending combat. "We knew this was coming." Dr. Patricia Mills was with them. Jake noticed her presence both a comfort and a betrayal. She had held out as long as she could, but when the video went viral, she had no choice but to confirm what she knew. Her face through the windshield looked pained, apologetic. The lead officer was a man named Richard Brennan, a 30-year veteran of wildlife services who had seen every possible variation of human-wildlife conflict. He approached Jake's porch with the weary authority of someone who expected compliance, but was prepared for resistance. His hand rested casually on his tranquilizer gun, a gesture that made Shadow emit a low growl that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. "Mr. Sullivan," Brennan began, his voice professionally neutral, "we've received multiple reports and video evidence that you're harboring a wild wolf without proper permits. We're here to assess the situation and take appropriate action." Jake stepped out onto the porch, Shadow immediately positioning himself between Jake and the officers. "He's not wild," Jake said simply. "I raised him from 2 weeks old. He's never known any life but this one." Brennan's expression softened slightly, but his stance remained firm. "That may be true, but the law is clear. Wolves are protected species and cannot be kept as pets. The animal needs to be relocated to a licensed facility or reintroduced to an appropriate wild habitat." "His name is Shadow," Jake said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had commanded men in battle, "and he's not going anywhere he doesn't want to go." The standoff lasted several tense minutes. Shadow never moved from his protective position, his amber eyes tracking every human present with an intelligence that made several officers step back unconsciously. His size was intimidating enough, but it was the controlled power, the sense of a predator choosing not to attack, that made the situation feel like a powder keg waiting for a spark. Patricia finally broke the silence. "Richard, may I?" She approached slowly, her movements careful and non-threatening. "Jake, we need to find a solution here. Shadow is magnificent, but you have to understand the liability. If he hurts someone, even accidentally, it's not just him who pays the price. It's you, and it's every wolf in Montana who will face increased persecution." "He would never hurt anyone," Jake insisted, but even as he said it, he knew it wasn't entirely true. Shadow would absolutely hurt someone if they threatened Jake. That protective instinct was hardwired into his DNA, strengthened by their bond. "There might be another way," a new voice said. Tom Henderson had arrived, parking his truck behind the official vehicles. With him was someone Jake didn't expect, Judge Margaret Ellis, a retired federal judge who still carried significant influence in Montana legal circles. She was also, Jake learned later, Tom's sister-in-law. "Margaret," Brennan said, surprise evident in his voice. "This isn't exactly your jurisdiction." "Wildlife law has always been an interest of mine," she replied smoothly, "and I believe there's precedent for special circumstances permits in cases of documented human-wildlife bonding that provides therapeutic benefit." She produced a folder thick with legal documents. "Mr. Sullivan is a decorated veteran with documented PTSD. His medical records, which he has authorized me to reference, show marked improvement since beginning his relationship with this animal." Jake looked at Tom in amazement. The retired sheriff shrugged. "Told you I'd help if I could." The discussion moved inside, though Shadow refused to leave Jake's side, his massive presence making the small cabin feel even smaller. Judge Ellis laid out her case with the precision of someone who had spent decades constructing legal arguments. There were precedents, she explained, rare but existing, where special permits had been granted for therapeutic animal relationships that fell outside normal regulations. "The key," she said, looking directly at Brennan, "is demonstrating that the benefit to the human outweighs the potential risk and that appropriate safeguards are in place." Brennan was skeptical. Those precedents involved domesticated animals with wild ancestry, not pure wolves. This is entirely different. The debate continued for hours, with Shadow lying at Jake's feet, alert but calm. Patricia provided medical testimony about Jake's transformation since finding Shadow. Tom testified about the controlled, non-aggressive behavior he had witnessed. Even some of Jake's neighbors had shown up, curious about the commotion, and several spoke up about how Shadow had never shown aggression toward them or their animals. It was late afternoon when everything changed. A scream from outside sent everyone rushing to the porch. One of the wildlife officers was backing away from the tree line, his face pale with terror. Behind him, emerging from the forest with the confident gait of an apex predator, was a massive grizzly bear. The bear was clearly agitated, possibly rabid from the foam around its mouth, and it had fixated on the group of humans as either threat or prey. Several officers reached for weapons, but the bear was too close, moving too fast. It would be on them before anyone could get a clean shot. Shadow moved like black lightning. One moment he was beside Jake, The next, he was between the humans and the bear, his body low, a snarl ripping from his throat that made everyone, including the grizzly, freeze. The bear outweighed Shadow by at least 300 pounds, but the wolf showed no fear, no hesitation. This was his territory. These were his humans to protect. The confrontation was brief, but intense. Shadow didn't attack, but his positioning, his vocalization, his sheer presence communicated something primal to the bear. This was not prey behavior. This was predator facing predator, and the wolf was making it clear that the cost of advancing would be paid in blood. The bear, perhaps sensing that even victory would come with devastating wounds, chose retreat. It huffed, shook its massive head, and lumbered back into the forest. Shadow maintained his defensive position until the bear was completely out of sight, then calmly walked back to Jake's side as if he had just performed a routine task. The silence that followed was profound. Everyone present had just witnessed something that challenged their understanding of animal behavior. A wolf raised by a human had just risked his life to protect not just his bonded human but strangers, some of whom were there to take him away. Brennan was the first to speak, his voice shaky. That bear would have killed someone, maybe several someones. Shadow just saved our lives. One of the younger officers said, awe evident in his tone. Judge Ellis seized the moment. Gentlemen, I believe you just witnessed exactly why this bond should be protected, not severed. This isn't just a wild animal living with a human. This is a partnership that benefits both species. The mood had shifted dramatically. The officers who had arrived ready to tranquilize and remove a dangerous, wild animal were now looking at Shadow with something approaching respect. Brennan ran a hand through his gray hair, his professional duty warring with what he had just experienced. There would need to be conditions, he said slowly, and Jake's heart leaped with hope. Regular inspections, secure fencing, liability insurance, no public appearances, and absolutely no breeding. Agreed, Jake said immediately. And if there's any aggressive incident, any attack on humans or livestock, the permit is immediately revoked. Understood. Patricia spoke up. I'd be willing to provide ongoing veterinary supervision, document the relationship for scientific purposes. This could be valuable research into human-wolf bonding. Over the next 2 hours, they hammered out an agreement. It was unprecedented, possibly legally questionable, but it was a solution that everyone could live with. Shadow would be registered as a therapeutic support animal under a special exotic species permit. Jake would have to meet strict requirements, submit to regular inspections, and maintain massive liability insurance, but Shadow could stay. As the convoy prepared to leave, Brennan approached Jake privately. You know this is extraordinary, right? We're bending a lot of rules here. I know, Jake replied. Thank you. Brennan looked at Shadow, who was watching the interaction with those unsettling, intelligent eyes. That wolf would die for you. And I for him, Jake said simply. Brennan nodded slowly. Take care of each other, then. And for God's sake, keep him away from people who don't understand what they're looking at. After everyone left, Jake sat on his porch with Shadow, the adrenaline of the day finally fading into exhaustion. The wolf leaned against him, a warm, solid presence that grounded him in reality. They had won, against all odds. The abandoned puppy, who turned out to be a wolf, could stay with the broken soldier, who had turned out to be healable. The story of Jake and Shadow spread throughout Montana and beyond, though Jake did everything possible to avoid publicity. Scientists wanted to study them. Documentary makers wanted to film them. Animal rights activists wanted to use them as either positive example or cautionary tale, depending on their stance. Jake refused them all. This wasn't about making a statement or proving a point. This was about two damaged souls who had found healing in each other. The months that followed were not without challenges. Shadow's wild instincts couldn't be completely suppressed. He still hunted, though Jake managed to direct this toward controlling the overpopulated deer that plagued local gardens. He still howled to the wild packs, though he never joined them. He still displayed protective aggression when strangers approached Jake, though he learned to moderate his response to Jake's verbal commands. Jake, for his part, had to adjust his entire life around Shadow's needs. No more trips to town with his companion, no more casual visitors. No more pretending that Shadow was just an unusual dog. He installed 8-foot fencing around a 5-acre portion of his property, though Shadow could have cleared it easily if he chose. The fence was more symbol than barrier, a line that marked where the domestic ended and the wild began. The wild pack still visited periodically, drawn by Shadow's presence. Jake would watch from his window as Shadow interacted with them at the fence line, complex communications passing between them that Jake couldn't fully understand. Sometimes he wondered if Shadow regretted his choice, if the call of his own kind was stronger than the bond they shared. But Shadow always returned to the cabin, always chose to sleep beside Jake's bed, always positioned himself between Jake and any perceived threat. Patricia visited monthly, documenting everything: Shadow's physical development, his behavior patterns, his interaction with Jake. All of it went into meticulous notes that she hoped would someday help other people understand the depth of connection possible between humans and wild animals. She was particularly fascinated by Shadow's ability to read Jake's emotional state, often responding to anxiety or distress before Jake himself was fully aware of it. "He knows you better than you know yourself," she observed during one visit, watching Shadow nudge Jake away from a window where he had been standing, lost in some dark memory. "It's like he can smell your emotional changes." "He probably can," Jake replied, automatically responding to Shadow's redirection by sitting down and accepting the massive wolf head that landed in his lap, demanding attention. The first winter together as legal partners was harsh, with record snowfall that isolated the cabin for weeks at a time. But Jake found the isolation comfortable now rather than oppressive. Shadow thrived in the cold, his thick coat perfect for the Montana winter. They developed new routines: morning patrols through the snow, afternoon naps by the fire, evening howling sessions where Jake would sit and listen as Shadow sang to the moon and received answers from the mountains. One night, a blizzard worse than the one that had brought them together raged outside. Jake woke from a nightmare. Not of war this time, but of losing Shadow, of watching him disappear into the forest forever. He found Shadow already awake, watching him with those amber eyes that held more understanding than any animal should possess. "I know you could leave," Jake said into the darkness. "Anytime you wanted. You could just go. Be what you were born to be." Shadow huffed softly and laid his head on the bed beside Jake's hand, a gesture of reassurance that needed no translation. This was what he was born to be, not just wolf, but guardian, companion, friend. The choice had been made long ago in the snow and cold, when two lost souls found each other. As spring arrived, bringing with it the first anniversary of their meeting, Jake reflected on the journey they had taken, from the tiny dying puppy that fit in his palm to the magnificent wolf that could take down an elk or face off a grizzly, from the broken soldier who could barely function to the man who had found purpose and peace in the most unlikely partnership. Tom Henderson stopped by on the anniversary day, bringing with him a local reporter who had been pestering him for months about the story. Jake was ready to refuse again, but Tom held up a hand.
"Hear her out," he said.
"She's not looking for sensation. She wants to write about veteran recovery, about alternative therapies, about the healing power of animal bonds. Shadow is just part of a bigger story." The reporter, a young woman named Sarah Chen, was respectful and genuine. She didn't want to sensationalize or exploit. She wanted to help other veterans who might be struggling, to show them that healing could come from unexpected places. "How many soldiers come home broken and never find their way back?" she asked. "Your story could help them." Jake looked at Shadow, who was watching the interaction with his usual intense focus. "What do you think, boy? Want to be famous?" Shadow's response was to yawn enormously and flop down on the porch, clearly unimpressed with the idea of fame. But Jake saw something else in the wolf's relaxed posture, a confidence that said their bond was strong enough to withstand scrutiny, that their story was worth telling. "All right," Jake agreed, "but the focus stays on veteran recovery, not on Shadow being a wolf. He's just a very unusual therapy animal." The article, when it was published, struck exactly the right tone. It talked about unconventional healing, about the bonds between humans and animals that transcend species, about finding hope in the most unexpected places. Shadow was mentioned, but not sensationalized. The piece respected both Jake's privacy and Shadow's nature. The response was overwhelming. Veterans from across the country reached out, sharing their own stories of animal companions who had saved them from the darkness. Some had dogs, some had horses, one had a rescued hawk, but all had found what Jake had found, a reason to keep going, a bond that pulled them out of their own damaged minds and into a relationship that demanded presence and purpose. Jake started corresponding with some of them, sharing what he had learned about routine, about patience, about allowing yourself to be vulnerable with a creature that would never judge your weakness. Shadow would lie beside him as he typed emails or wrote letters, occasionally nudging his elbow when he'd been at it too long, reminding him that the physical world needed attention too. One evening, as the sun set over the Montana mountains, Jake and Shadow sat in their usual spot on the porch. The wolf pack was visible in the distance, moving through the valley on some unknowable mission. Shadow watched them, but made no move to join them. His choice had been made and remade every day for a year. "Thank you," Jake said quietly, "for choosing me, for staying." Shadow turned those remarkable amber eyes on Jake, and in them was everything that didn't need to be said. The gratitude was mutual, the salvation was shared, the bond was unbreakable. As darkness fell, Shadow began his nightly howl, but this time Jake joined him, adding his human voice to the ancient song. It was awkward, probably ridiculous, certainly nothing like the pure wild music Shadow produced, but Shadow seemed to approve, his tail wagging slightly as they sang together to the rising moon. In the distance, the wild pack answered, the voices carrying across the valley in a harmony as old as time. But Shadow didn't look toward them with longing anymore. He looked at Jake, his chosen pack, his rescued human, his purpose. The abandoned puppy, who was never a puppy at all, had grown into exactly what he was meant to be, not tame, not wild, but something in between, something unique. The future stretched before them, uncertain as always. There would be challenges, Jake knew. Shadow would continue to age, continue to be what he was, a wolf living in a human world by choice rather than nature. Jake would continue to heal, continue to find pieces of himself he thought war had destroyed forever. But they would face it together, the veteran and the wolf, bound by a storm and a choice and a love that transcended species. As they went inside for the night, Shadow padding silently beside Jake, the moon rose full over the mountains. Somewhere in the forest, the wild pack hunted and howled and lived as wolves had always lived. But in a small cabin in Montana, a different kind of wolf curled up beside a human's bed, content with his choice, guarding the man who had saved him from the snow all those months ago. The storm that had brought them together had been fierce but brief. The bond they had built would last a lifetime. In saving each other, they had discovered something precious and rare, a connection that proved love and loyalty know no boundaries, not of species, not of nature, not of what the world says is possible. They were living proof that sometimes the most profound healing comes from the most unexpected places, and that family is not always defined by blood or species but by choice, by dedication, and by the simple act of refusing to give up on each other when the rest of the world says you should.